Hello everyone, welcome to my Batman Arkham Knight, Knightmare difficulty, no damage walkthrough. This will be the Arkham Knight's HQ and the boss fight against the Arkham Knight / Jason Todd. And this is an interesting part of the walkthrough. And when I say interesting, I mean completely fucking tedious. Because we all know that when Rocksteady were teasing the identity of the Arkham Knight, they were trying their best to make sure that the identity of the Arkham Knight was kept secret before the game released. And, of course, a lot of people had already figured out exactly who the Arkham Knight was, just based on, like, the promotional images that were given, and then when the game released, people had already figured out the Arkham Knight's identity before they even got to his boss fight. But because there are a lot of leaks involving the Arkham Knight and his actual identity as Jason Todd, this bled into Rocksteady's handling of actually blocking a certain scene in the game via certain outlets. So, you guys know that I record my YouTube videos through Share Factory / the capture system that is utilized via PS4 or PS5. So, because I am using these particular systems to actually capture my videos, there comes certain restrictions involved, where the developers of these games can make a deal with Sony to block certain scenes so that you cannot use the capture system to actually capture these scenes. It's a practice that in and of itself doesn't make any fucking sense, because there are so many ways for people to just capture those block scenes using other kinds of capture software. So what is the whole point of trying to block a scene when there's already going to be so many people using other capture devices to capture the scene that you've just blocked? And it's not like you're limiting the amount of people that are actually recording that scene, because like thousands of people are recording this scene using other forms of capture software, and the people that actually use Sony's capture system represent a very small percentage, and I'm of the small percentage that actually utilizes Sony's capture system in a way that actually adheres to their guidelines, and I'm not violating anything. But Rocksteady decided to make a deal with Sony to block the ability to capture the Arkham Knight's boss fight, because in that boss fight, he reveals himself as Jason Todd. And this whole block scene starts from the moment he reveals himself as Jason Todd up until the point where you confront Scarecrow at the top of that tower. And it was all done this way as part of a feeble attempt by Rocksteady to cover up the Arkham Knight's identity and to actually prevent his identity from spreading out too much onto the internet during 2015. And I said during 2015. This game is 7 years old at this point. Everyone knows who the Arkham Knight is. Everyone knows that the Arkham Knight is Jason Todd. So why they haven't given the player the ability to actually capture that scene on PlayStation boggles the mind. I mean, I don't know how these kind of deals work, but there's really no justification you can give as to why this should still be a thing 7 years after your game releases. But continuing on, this was presenting as a very stupid challenge on my part, because I had to figure out some sort of way to bypass this really arbitrary and downright confounding restriction that Rocksteady decided to put upon themselves to limit content creators to actually do something creative with their game. You're essentially saying that as much as we respect your love for this game and your desire to actually play this game, we don't actually give a fuck about that, so we want to limit your ability to actually capture this game and actually do some interesting content for it, like doing walkthroughs, for instance. So I had to do a very unorthodox method to actually capture that scene, which worked, but at the same time presented with certain issues that hindered my ability to play through that section in a very effective manner. So what I had to do to actually capture the Arkham Knight's boss fight and completely bypass this fucking restriction is I had to initiate PlayStation Remote Play on my iPhone so that the actual video that was capturing on my TV would actually transfer onto my phone. So I'd be playing the game through my phone. And also, I had to use my PS4 controller and connect with my iPhone via Bluetooth in order to utilize a controller format that wasn't so cumbersome to deal with, because when you're using the controller format that is provided on iPhone, it is so hard to have the dexterity needed to hit the buttons the right way that allows you to do very complex actions, something that a controller can easily provide, but not something on iPhone. But anyway, after transferring the video onto iPhone so that I can actually see it on my iPhone, and after using my PS4 controller via Bluetooth to actually play the game on my iPhone, I was able to then use the screen recording feature on iPhone, which by the way is a really cool feature, to actually capture what was on my screen, and the game was actually showing on that screen. So you'll be seeing a very different format to the video when we get to the Arkham Knight's boss fight that will indicate that I used remote play to actually capture that part of the game, which I shouldn't have to do if Rocksteady had any common sense. But this was also presenting with another problem where, because I was using a Wi-Fi connection to bridge the gap between my iPhone and my PS5 so that my PS5 could transfer its video format onto the iPhone, I was at the risk of lag, and I was at the risk of very poor network connection. And even though I was right next to my PS5, the amount of times my game would lag, or my inputs wouldn't register correctly, or the video format would cut and there was a lot of buffering happening, I mean, it was pretty bad. But I had to pause the game a couple of times, and then I also had to restart the checkpoint at certain points whenever those issues would fuck with my gameplay and I would take damage in order to deliver satisfactory gameplay performance for this walkthrough. And that is what you're going to be seeing with the Arkham Knight's boss fight, before eventually, when we reunite with Oracle, the gameplay recording is actually resuming on my PS5, so I can immediately resume control of the game via my PS5 and not have to play it through an iPhone. That right there is the tedious process I had to go through that is completely unnecessary, and there is no sense of accomplishment achieved with this, because again, Rocksteady, if they had any sort of common sense, would actually give you the ability to capture that scene on your PlayStation console 7 years after the game has released, when everyone knows the identity of the Arkham Knight. And of course, this is also complete ignorance on my part, because I don't know how exactly these deals work, but I know for sure it's going to be a very convoluted deal process, like what it is with our financial systems, our school systems, or anything that involves getting a job. It's going to be just as convoluted as that. But there's nothing unauthorized or anything that is going to present as some sort of stealing of intellectual property if you're recording a scene that everybody knows about 7 years after the game has released. So why is it that this is such a problem for Rocksteady and also for Sony if I'm going to be capturing a scene that in their mind presents as some kind of spoiler? Or for all we know, this is complete arrogance on Rocksteady's part if they feel that the Arkham Knight story was actually satisfactory in Arkham Knight, and they felt that their reveal of the Arkham Knight's identity as Jason Todd was done so properly that in order to make the scene feel even more special, they make it where you don't capture it, just like what those developers did for Persona 5, where they made it impossible to capture Persona 5 on PlayStation, yet you use any other form of capture software and you can capture the game. So how many people are you exactly eliminating when you limit the ability to capture on PlayStation? Not that many people, because more people use other forms of capture software rather than PlayStation's own capture system in order to actually capture the game. And I'm not saying that PlayStation is a bad media for actually capturing gameplay. I love it to death, and I gotta give credit to Sony for giving the player that ability. But when you're having to restrict certain moments in the game for really stupid reasons, like what I've just listed, it doesn't make any sense. And your indulgence into the brand is completely compromised by the fact that the developers have no common sense with giving content creators the ability to actually make the game popular with other people through very creative means. And that's all I'm gonna say right there, guys. But it's just, that is what I had to put up with to actually record the Arkham Knight's boss fight, because of this really stupid format that they decided to favor. And now that I've actually found a way to record block scenes on PlayStation, I can probably use it for other games. Maybe I'll go back to Yakuza Kiwami, which is highly unlikely because that game is fucking shit. And the developers wanting to block the final scene of the game, which is completely underwhelming with a very shit boss fight that is one of the worst boss fights ever made in gaming history. And you're not caring one bit about the story because of how much you're having to run back to that boss, given the ancient checkpoint system that they're actually using that does not conform to modern standards of checkpoint systems. The developers thinking that that is acceptable it is downright insulting, really insulting, and that is probably why I won't be going to Yakuza Kiwami anytime soon. And I still have Chapter 7 saved in my capture gallery, but the incentive for actually doing the commentary for that is very little compared to what I'm doing with Batman Arkham Knight. But it's a good thing as well that I've actually figured out a way to record block scenes, and hopefully this will be useful, even though the methodology involved does present with its own problems, like what I've just discussed. But that is just a very scummy practice that Rocksteady decided to favor, and I do not approve of it whatsoever. But anyway, having just relayed this information to you guys, let us explain what I'll be doing for this walkthrough. So, not only will I be doing the Arkham Knight's HQ and the Arkham Knight's boss fight, but I'll be doing some of the side missions. And this right here, we're completing the Fireman side mission, and we're rescuing Chief Underhill from this Predator encounter right here, which is a really fun Predator encounter if you do it right. So I'm using this ladder to my advantage. You'll want to use this ladder, because if you use any other ladder, there are so many other avenues that the enemies can go down that it's hard to keep track of them. Whereas in this case, there are only 2 avenues that the enemies can go to actually get the drop on you. From here and behind me, because there's another ladder behind me, but the enemies are not trying to go down that path right now. And this was all on the first attempt, by the way. I mean, not really though, because I did actually create a save data for this particular part of the game when you're rescuing Chief Underhill, and I saved it onto a USB so that anytime I failed, and I had to do this because of one particular reason, where anytime I restarted this encounter after I cleared out a certain number of enemies, I would not get 16 enemies, I would get less enemies, which presented as a confounding variable in this case. So to avoid this, I tried to make sure that I backed up my save. Like I did the backup save system that Arkham Knight has, and then I saved my save data onto a USB, and then anytime I failed this sequence, I would just restart the entire Predator encounter from the beginning rather than having to restart from a checkpoint in the middle of the encounter, which was very helpful in this case. But the strategy that I use for this sequence is the exact same strategy I'll be using for the A Matter of Family DLC, and also it's the same strategy that I used for Mr. Freeze when I was doing the first Predator encounter, where I use the dive bomb technique to lure enemies to a certain point right near a ladder, and then as they're climbing the ladder, I knock them off using the Batarang. And because the enemies are so keen on continuing to climb up the ladder to actually locate your last known position, because the enemy that you knocked off with the Batarang saw you for a bit, you can use this as a way to loop the encounters, and it's so much fun to do when you get these kind of opportunities to do it in these Predator encounters. But that's done, and I've also done some APC lieutenants as well, and I had to bum rush those APC lieutenants like crazy, which just goes to show how mindless that side mission is when you're so infuriated with the way the Batmobile controls that you're having to rely upon bulldozing the APCs just to deal a substantial amount of damage, and it doesn't even knock them over. Apparently, the APCs have a greater amount of weight and actual resistance to the Batmobile's ramming speed than the Batmobile itself. That is so underwhelming, and it completely ruins the power fantasy involved with Batman. But that is probably the mindless gameplay that they wanted you to favor with the APC side mission, which wouldn't surprise you at this point given how much lack of care was displayed by Rocksteady when developing this game. But I've done those side missions, and now we're on to the Arkham Knight's HQ, which takes place in an abandoned shopping mall, yet for whatever reason there's a drilling machine here, and this hole has been made, and we're using a winch. How on earth did the Arkham Knight take the time to develop this, or is it more so that this was always a dead area in this part of Gotham City? And can I just say that Founders Island represents Gotham City at its worst, because when you go under street level in Founders Island, and you're just seeing the layout of the environments, and you're just seeing how convoluted the infrastructure is that they decided to favor with Founders Island, when the infrastructure is going to be that compromised, it's no wonder why Gotham City is filled with so much crime. You can tell when a city is crime-infested if its own infrastructure is going to be that compromised and that convoluted, almost on the same degree as Raccoon City from the original version of Resident Evil 3, because some of the ways that they place the alleys don't make any sense. And they just felt so maze-like, and the corridors were cramped. There, like, certain areas just led to other areas for no reason. Like, why the hell is there a park area right next to the treatment plant? And when you look at other areas of the city, you just gotta wonder, like, why there is this level of irrationality with how the areas are placed. And you're not thinking of it at all because, of course, it's part of the charm of the game. But I'm pretty sure there are real-life cities out there that favor such terrible infrastructure like that. And you go to those places, and they are the most crime-infested cities by far. Like that really says a lot when the city is so ridden with crime that it's compromised the ability for people affiliated with the infrastructure of a city to deliver substantial changes that actually promote positive community development and financial impact. And it's not a surprise right there, given that America's infrastructure is always considered to be the worst form of city planning, road planning, and street planning ever in the entire world. And there are actual articles about this. And I watched a YouTube channel by the name of, I believe he's called Now These Bikes. But he did a whole video series regarding America's infrastructure, and I learned some very interesting ideas and facts about the way America had actually designed their streets and roads and cities that likely lead to more crime, more housing costs, and more poor community planning. But, he mentioned that, it's stuff like the way America combines elements of streets and roads. Like, streets and roads are two different things entirely. Like, roads are what you encounter when you're on highways. Like, when you're on a long stretch of concrete pavement that is built for the single purpose of going straight, to actually give, like, a bit of space for cars to move at their fastest speed, and to not be dealing with any kind of moments where there are side streets actually connecting with that road. Like, the whole idea of side streets and the whole idea of like tiny areas like for cars that are built in relation to the way buildings are close to each other, like those represent streets. And when you go to Europe, for instance, Europe does this with a lot of its cities, but it doesn't try to combine elements of streets and roads together. So therefore, it doesn't try to make their cities so dependent upon cars. Because the main problem with America's cities is that they're designed so that cars are always the favored option. They're never designed so that they're friendly for pedestrians. Like, they're not so pedestrian friendly in their implementation, they're car friendly in their implementation. And because cars are such a crucial part to actually living in America's cities, they therefore provide a financial impact in the negative extrema that makes it very hard to actually earn a living. And I mean, that's not just the only factor, there are many other factors associated with this. But the main point here being is that America doesn't do the same thing as Europe. What they actually do is they combine elements of streets and roads together to create something called a strode. And a strode is a very inefficient model for actually making transportation via cars useful. And the thing is that it also presents with certain problems where accidents happen more often on stroads compared to what's happening in Europe, where because they've separated out streets and roads, accidents are less likely to happen because of the fact that you have the case with stroads where you have the one element of a road where it's a long stretch of pavement that allows cars to go for a long duration at a high speed, but then they also combine elements of streets where they have side streets actually connecting two roads. That is what enables accidents to happen more often, and also this is what makes it very hard for sidewalks to be implemented. I mean, you go to a lot of American cities and you just find that sidewalks are hardly to be seen, and even when they are seen, they're placed in areas where it's so easy to be hit by a car. And that is the most pedestrian harmful way of actually implementing an infrastructure. And this is what's leading to a very inefficient model where housing costs are increasing because of the car-dependent nature of these cities. And so therefore, buying a house presents with a lot more financial consequences, which makes them very hard to get. And also, it's hard to make a living without a car. And it was a very interesting idea to really think about. And also, one thing that I actually learned about America's highways is the reason why they're spaced out the way they are, and the reason why they're separated out the way they are, is because during the events of the Cold War, General Eisenhower implemented a plan to limit casualties. It was a part of a minimal loss scenario, where if he was making the highways as separate apart, and they weren't causing people to be clustered together so much, like you'd be getting in certain cities where you have like a road in a circle around the city, and you therefore have people clustering in those cities. Like, the way General Eisenhower tried to separate out these highways so that he was limiting the casualties, that's why the highways are structured as such, and that's why at times they can be very inefficient, which was a very interesting idea to think about. And of course, that might have worked back in the Cold War era, but this is not the Cold War. And I'm guessing they're still implementing it because they feel that method works, but at the same time, it makes it hard for people to earn a living, or you get a lot of accidents happening, or the way that the highways are laid out. They just present with additional variables that you have to account for while you're driving that just make driving a lot more dangerous. And that was a pretty interesting concept to realize. I mean, I didn't learn it from the video. One of my family members had told me, but it was very, very interesting to learn that. And, you know, going back to Naudi's bikes, he actually mentioned that the way we do speed limits is entirely wrong. Because apparently, the way we do speed limits, like the way speed limits are set for highways, is that they look at the number of cars actually driving on that highway, and they use something called the 80% rule, where they look at the speeds of each car. And whatever represents the 80th percentile of speeds is what actually becomes the speed limit. But this is a very inefficient model because most of the time, the 80 percentile rule doesn't conform to the design speed of the actual highway. And the design speed is what the speed should actually be based on the actual design of the highway. And there are several moments in my case where I'm going on a highway and the speed limit is like 55 miles per hour, but the actual design of the road is complementary to the whole idea of a faster speed limit. So that right there is a great example of when the 80th percentile rule doesn't work properly, and therefore it leads to a lot of moments where traffic just comes to a halt. Traffic lights become an annoyance because they place so many traffic lights along a highway that it's just so hard to get anywhere, and you don't really get that as much in Europe apparently. Yeah, pretty annoying. But relating this to Gotham, just looking at Founders Island and just the way the area looks, and with the way the streets look, with the amount of construction going on, with the amount of decommissioned areas, and just the way the roads are laid out, and just the way the areas feel cramped, it's no wonder Gotham is such a crime-ridden state, because most likely such elements to the city, like what I've just discussed, are contributing to the increase in crime. And it seems no matter how many millions Bruce Wayne puts into the actual redevelopment of Gotham, it's still not enough because these things take so long to do, and during that interim, things can happen that just hinder development. So yeah, it is definitely understandable why Rocksteady decided to favor the kind of format that they favor with Founders Island. And I don't really notice it as much with Bleak Island or Miagani Island. It's Founders Island where this really shows. But I've just done the first part of the Arkham Knight's boss fight, where you have to be in the Batmobile and you have to lure him down those pots. That is a pretty stupid fight because of the camera. It's not the Arkham Knight that's dangerous, it's the fucking camera. Because when you go down those tunnels to lure him into the explosive devices, the camera assumes a fixed perspective, and it doesn't stay right above the Batmobile like normally. So because of the fact that the Batmobile and the camera are moving independent of one another, it leads to so many moments where your controls feel very loose, and there are so many moments where you're straight up fishtailing. And fishtailing, if you don't know, is a driving terminology. Look it up if you don't understand what it is. But basically, it's just so hard to maintain control with the camera assuming a fixed position, and it makes it so hard to tell which way I'm going. And it also makes it hard to tell if I've moved the left analog stick enough to actually do the turn that I needed, because sometimes I overextend on my turn and I collide with obstacles. That's a pretty dumb fight. But here we have the final encounter with the Arkham Knight / Jason Todd. And as you'll see right here, this is a very different quality to the video, and you'll be seeing the icons normally associated with PlayStation at the bottom of the screen, because that's what you normally see when you're using Remote Play on your iPhone. But I'm going to be taking this nice and slowly because, of course, my network issues were hindering my ability to do this effectively. And also, right here, you'll notice that Batman is saying that I can't glide or go to a gargoyle point right near Jason. But that piece of programming that prevents you from actually going to where Jason is actually gets in the way of the grapple detection, because you'll see right there, I was directly under the railing, so I should have grappled onto that, but for some reason Batman was grappling onto the gargoyle point behind me, which is where I was previously, and it's the gargoyle point that is outside of Jason's line of view. So because there are times where the game doesn't properly understand where you're going and when it shouldn't be forcing that kind of restriction upon you, there are just a lot of moments where it hinders your ability to get to Jason, and you end up making a mistake because the game decided to fuck you. And this boss fight overall is a lot better than the previous one, but it's still an underwhelming boss fight, because it's not really a boss fight, it's just a series of Predator encounters. That's really what it is. And he goes down pretty fast, but I'm guessing that's mainly because he's not thinking straight due to Batman being around. The Arkham Knight's motivations have been so, like, sporadic. He's wanted Batman to suffer, then now he wants Batman dead, then he goes back to suffering, then he goes back to killing. Too bad they didn't devote enough time to actually developing Jason's character correctly. He just flip-flops between, like, two different states of mentalities. So, yeah, it definitely shows with this kind of botched-up mess of a boss fight. But I don't really care so much, because I never really feel like the Batman Arkham Knight's gameplay systems are complementary to a traditional boss fight format. This actually feels a little more complementary to the gameplay format that the Arkham games favor. And I'm not saying this isn't fun. This is a lot of fun, actually, and this is when we're being introduced to optic deflection armor enemies. And did you see that just then? I did a takedown on the first enemy that was in the smoke, and because I had X2 combo, Batman was able to use multiple batarangs to knock over the enemies, and I didn't even know there was an enemy in the smoke cloud. And that was my intention, because I was hoping he would just use one batarang, but he used multiple batarangs, and I did not know there were multiple enemies. So yeah, that was very handy. One of the few times where I can appreciate the game not distinguishing between combat and Predator properly. But for this part right here, I'm forced to wait a little bit for the enemies to go away from the Arkham Knight, and I'm going to use the remote hacking device in the drone. You'll need to use the remote hacking device in the drone every single phase for this boss fight. But that was a mistake. I needed to grapple onto that point. There are just times in this boss fight where the grapple detection fucks you, but right now the enemies are nowhere near the Arkham Knight, so now is my chance to actually go where he is. But I'm not seeing where he is, because I'm not seeing where the drone is, but he's right over there. And now I need to basically make sure that his laser isn't pointed at me, and it's a very simple path to get to him. And then the final phase is dumb, because there are no enemies, but he has two turrets, a drone, and his rifle. And it's just a matter of patience at that point. Like, I feel like this fight is more so about patience than anything else, not really with skill. I mean, it's nice that it works, but at the same time, they could have made the format a little bit more engaging rather than just simply waiting for a certain time. And I don't know where the previous enemies were, but they despawned. But it doesn't matter, because I had to restart this part a couple of times because I messed up on my route. I was trying to follow the same route that Batman Arkham Videos did, but it was just presenting with so many problems. Instead, I'm going to take the left path. In Batman Arkham Videos' channel, he uses the right path, which is not what you want to do. You'll need to blind the drone and then wait for the turrets to be looking away from you. At this particular rotation, this is when you want to move. Remain crouched still, because that right turret is still looking at you. And that is the end of this boss fight. Yeah, it's pretty simple, but I'm not going to hold anything against the game. It takes place at a point where this is practically the last day of Batman's career as a vigilante. And I mean, a lot of his rogues gallery isn't exactly at their height right now, and a lot of them have kind of disappeared, like with Bane, for instance. So this is really at a point where crime is at an all-time low, and I'm guessing to complement the whole idea of crime being at an all-time low, that's why the boss fights are pretty simple on this game, which makes a lot of sense, and I totally understand that, and it definitely fits the respective gameplay format that Batman Arkham Knight favors. So yeah, not bad. I mean, they could have been better. They could have been a little bit more engaging with these boss fights, but I think, to be fair, they could have been worse. I'm just glad they weren't worse. I'm just glad they were average at best. But that's the end of that whole moment where I had to use remote play, and from here, it's all back on PS5, because this is when the gameplay recording resumes. And we're being assailed by a lot of drones right now, only nowhere near to the same kind of degree as what you'd be getting with the bombs, for instance, because this arrangement isn't too bad. And you have to stay within range of the remote control, obviously, so that represents your barrier. But the enemy arrangement, you can get rid of them very easily with your 60mm cannon, and your EMP will also help. And this Batmobile has every single upgrade that you would have potentially gotten had you chosen the other choice. So Obviously, I have all the upgrades, so this doesn't matter. But on the original new game, this Batmobile has everything. I believe it also has every single version of the weapons generator system. So I think it has the maxed out secondary weapon energy charge. So you'll be able to use that, the CPU virus, and the EMP, and you'll be able to demolish these drones. And you notice right here, I'm using the missile launcher against the Diamondbacks. That's practically the fastest way to get rid of them, while still preserving a bit of your weapon energy. Just press square once on the Diamondback, and the missile launcher will instantly get rid of it. Yeah, the Diamondbacks are definitely one of the most dangerous drones, because they are very resilient to your 60mm shots, and they can be a nuisance when they can tank that many hits. The rest of these drones just aim for the turret, and you'll be able to get rid of them quickly, if you have the upgrades, of course, because there is that whole upgrade where you deal increased damage to the body, or you deal increased damage to the turret, and I believe the game makes you buy those upgrades for certain Riddler challenges or for AR challenges, so I'm glad that the developers are making you slot into the upgrades for New Game Plus, which is really good design, because I want them to embrace a whole model that actually feels practical, not like the Tynard model of gaming in his own deluded mindset. But here's a blooper, and that right there is a great example of the camera fucking me and completely making the Batmobile harder to control because I fishtailed. Fishtailing happens so much during that boss fight, and that is why I ended up taking damage and dying, because I had no idea what was coming, and I had no idea if I was making the turns correctly. So, Rocksteady, what were you thinking when actually designing the camera perspective for those encounters? But that's the end of this video. Stay tuned for the future videos. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.